Brian, thank you for joining us today at the Economic Times Global Business Summit. The ET Global Business Summit is really built for the business and political leadership of India. And I think it'd be great for all of them to understand from the mouth of the founder and CEO directly, what exactly is Airbnb and really how has it innovated and created its space in the travel ecosystem?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me here today. Airbnb is, I guess you could say, a new way to travel. We started this company over a decade ago, and the company started because I was a designer with my roommate living in San Francisco. I was living in a 3-bedroom apartment, and my roommate Joe and I had a problem. We couldn't afford to pay rent. It turns out that weekend, a design conference is coming to San Francisco. The hotels were sold out, and we had an idea. What if we turned our house into a bed and breakfast for the design conference? We didn't have any beds, but we pulled out 3 air beds and we called it airbedandbreakfast.com. We ended up hosting 3 people that weekend. Catherine was a woman from Boston. Amol was a 30-year-old originally from India. And Michael was a 45-year-old father 5 from Utah. We made enough money to pay our rent, but something more important happened. Our first 3 guests came as strangers and they left kind of feeling like insiders. And at that point, we realized maybe there's a bigger idea here. Maybe there are other people that wanted to host, like Joe and I, had some extra space, wanted to meet cool people, make some money. And maybe there are other guests, other people out there in the world like Michael, Cat, and Amol. I asked Joe, my roommate, I said, who's the best engineer you know? He said, my old roommate Nate is. And the 3 of us got together and we had this really simple idea. What if you could book someone's home the way you could book a hotel anywhere in the world? The problem was it was hard to trust other strangers without developing the components for trust. So we designed a system, and more than a decade later, we have millions of hosts, millions of homes around the world. And I think what we've created is probably a new category of travel based on truly things that are one of a kind, unique homes and unique spaces anywhere in the world.
You're a designer, and that's an incredible story. But Brian, this is a business conference. I want to know numbers. So I know Airbnb's raised, I think, $5 billion to date. Tell us, how does the business of Airbnb stack up today relative to other large hospitality companies?
One of the things that's pretty special about the Airbnb business, it's a capital light business. So yes, we've raised a substantial amount of money, but very importantly, we don't have to pour concrete or invest billions of dollars. Because the whole idea of Airbnb is people could provide what they already have in their life, their extra space, their extra time. And we're here to help match guest and host. But basically all this infrastructure, these trillions of dollars of infrastructure that already exist, millions of people's homes, we can better leverage them and we can utilize them better. And that's kind of what I think Airbnb does. And so because it's a capital light model, it works very well pretty much in an economic upturn and economic downturn. In fact, Airbnb was started during the Great Recession of 2008. And it was started before my co-founders and I could even raise any money. So it's a very great capital light network effect business that now welcomes hundreds of millions of people to our community.
So, the theme for today's session is leadership through crisis. And there's no doubt that as the fastest growing travel company in the world, you would have felt your own fair share of crisis over the last 6 months. As I understand, at one point, business fell as much as 80% in less than a few months. Help us understand the roller coaster that the last 6 months have been for Airbnb, from the realization that COVID was going to actually affect the business to the normalization or where you guys really are today.
Beginning of March, the world enters a global shutdown and billions of people are sheltering in place and global travel comes to a standstill, and the vast majority of our business drops and goes away. And this is a moment of crisis. It felt like I was captaining a ship and the torpedo hit the side of it. And we had to take very immediate action. The first thing that happened was we had more than $1 billion of customer deposits, and we didn't want them to feel unsafe. So we refunded their money, but the problem was that hosts were telling us they really needed the money. They were depending on the money that was being prepaid. And so we took $250 million in our own balance sheet and paid out hosts. And then from there, we had to make a lot of very difficult, very hard decisions, and had to essentially kind of restructure the company, simplify the roadmap. And really at the end of the day, we got really, really focused. We got focused on getting back to the roots and back to the basics of Airbnb. And, then all of a sudden we started seeing some glimmers of hope. People, after having been locked in their homes, locked down for months, were saying they want to get out of their home, but they don't want to get on planes. They're not traveling for business and they're not crossing borders, but they're getting in a car and they want to travel, not more than maybe a tank and a half of gas. And they want to stay in local communities. And so there was Airbnb for them. And so it's been a kind of optimistic kind of resurgence a bit.
One thing that stood up to me, and obviously we all follow your story closely, was a bit about how you handled some of that adversity. I mean, as I understand, you guys had to lay off almost 2,000 employees. And I know from experience, having worked with you guys in the past, Airbnb is really known to have a very employee-centric and humane culture. And I know downsizing and decisions like that are really hard decisions to take. I understand Airbnb approached it a little bit differently. And I wanted to understand a bit about how Airbnb handled restructuring in hard times and how it was able to really maintain its culture through that process.
One of the hardest things I think a CEO will ever have to do, if they have to do it, is to lay off a portion of their workforce. And it was certainly one of the most difficult decisions I've ever had to do. And it was one of the saddest days in my life when I had to inform our employees of it. I think that people in companies, they expect their leaders to have to make hard decisions, but they want to know that they'll do them with compassion and heart. And I think that the vast majority of people in positions of power and leadership have heart. I think the problem is that sometimes corporate processes, don't have the same heart as the people themselves. And they sometimes take a playbook and they kind of put it on autopilot. And we didn't want to do that. We wanted to really try to, handle this as personally as one could during a pandemic when you mostly have to do it on Zoom. So we wrote out a series of principles. We said, number one, we don't want to do 2 layoffs. So if we're going to do a layoff, we're going to unfortunately have to cut deep enough so that our future is secure and people don't have to worry about a second layoff happening. That the cuts we make have to be mapped to the business that we'll have in the future. And we didn't know when travel was come back. And we did know that when travel would come back, it would be different. So we had to map our cuts to where the future would look like. We wanted to do as much as we could for impacted employees. So we tried to be as generous as we could for impacted employees. And we wanted to make sure that the way we communicated was as kind of human and heartfelt and personal as we possibly could, knowing there were some limitations. And so we ended up having to reduce the size of our workforce, but we gave all employees that got laid off 14-week severance plus a week per year service. In the United States, for example, we also gave them a year's worth of healthcare because obviously healthcare is very much connected to your employer. But we did a couple other things that I think were kind of unique. One of the things we did is our team had an idea. They said, what if we took a percentage of our recruiting team and basically turned them into a job placement firm for those that were laid off to help them find another job? And then the next thing they recommended is, what if we also created an alumni directory so anyone that was laid off could opt in to putting their information online? We could publish it and other recruiters or other companies could contact them. Well, we ended up publishing this alumni directory and we ended up getting more. Last count I heard, it was over 500,000 people visited their profiles and their job descriptions. Now, I don't know how many of them got new opportunities, but I sincerely hope that a few of them did. And I think some of this stuff doesn't even cost anything for the company to do. And so that's what we tried to do. And it doesn't make it, I'm sure the whole experience was still very painful for those that were impacted. And for people who had to say goodbye to their friends, I can only imagine what that felt like. But, we tried to do the very best we could. Our original tagline was, when we started Airbnb, was travel like a human. That was the basic idea. And I always felt like the human part of that tagline was more important than the travel part of that tagline.
It's amazing. And I have to say, even having seen a number of companies out here, that directory has been a phenomenal resource because the ability for companies to look for talent that joins companies like Airbnb is a really unique thing. And it stood out to me as a very unique measure.
If other CEOs are in this predicament, I do think that is one of the things that doesn't actually cost the company any money and other people can do it. It's totally opt-in. And what it does is it shifts a little bit of the burden from the employee. You know, it allows the company that's got a much bigger platform to be able to support them. So there's a couple of these practices that I think could become normalized and they could actually benefit workers.
So, it's hard to say that we're out of the COVID crisis now, but things are starting to feel, I don't know if normal is the right word, but they're feeling stable, let's say. How do you see the travel industry over the next 6 months and even after that sort of changing or recovering from this point?
Well, the travel industry is never going to be the same. It is irreversibly altered. We can all debate and guess how it's going to change, but we know it's changed forever. We're never, ever going back to the way travel was in January because change doesn't go backwards, it only goes forward. I think that there's probably a couple things that are going to happen. The first thing that's going to happen is I think there's going to be more travel redistribution. I think in the world before the pandemic, there was probably an over concentration of tourists going to a handful of small cities, traveling and going to these kind of crowded tourist districts and visiting the same landmarks, typically waiting in really long lines and being in mass crowds. In the cities that were handling all these tourists, they didn't always like it even. They felt like sometimes this was what they labeled as over-tourism. And so my optimistic point of view is that travel will get redistributed. This is what we're seeing, and I know this is happening for the next 6 months. And basically people, instead of going to the same just couple dozen destinations, they'll still go to those places. They'll still get tourism, but they'll also redistribute to thousands of other communities. Because what's happening is people aren't just flying, they're traveling via car or train. They're going more nearby to nearby destinations. And these destinations happen to be smaller and less urban. In fact, 60% of our business is now outside of cities. And this has a way of leveling the playing field. Kind of the genie's out of the bottle. And then once you discover less urban areas, more rural areas, national parks, I think it just unlocks a whole other part of the world. And the other trend I think that's happening is that traveling and living are going to start to blur. People used to think of traveling as traveling for a couple nights for business or a week or two for vacation. But there's a third category of travel. It's a longer term travel. It's a few weeks, a month, a couple months. It's this really unique period of time where if you're working from home, you could work really from any home. And so that's a whole new category. Now that, people will go back to offices, but kind of like we all are now using Zoom, we might not all use it as much in the future. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. We're not all going to stop using Zoom and resume the way the world was. It kind of changed rolls forward.
Right. I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, today working anywhere really doesn't necessarily change your ability to contribute in the ways that you do, whether you're at home or not at home or whatever it may be. Okay, so Brian, I need to ask you the question that's on everyone's mind about your company. I'm sure you know what it's going to be. Let's talk about the IPO. You guys have been people have been waiting for a long time for the consumer, for the average public to be able to buy shares in your company. So many people love it. We know employees have often been very excited about the prospect of seeing true public liquidity on their equity. When's the IPO happening? Are you going to get it done before the election, before a new presidential regime comes in America? Are you thinking about a normal IPO, a direct listing, a SPAC? Give us the details that you can't give anybody else, that only the ET Global Business Summit gets to know about the Airbnb IPO.
Yeah, I don't want to be super boring and corporate, but I have to say that what I can say is this: we filed our S1, which is a registration statement with the Securities Exchange Commission. That put me in a quiet period, so unfortunately, I'm not allowed to comment on the IPO or the timing. But what I can say, and that I've said all along, is, before the pandemic hit, we were working on the S1. We were intending to file it. Then obviously COVID-19 happens, the business drops precipitously. We put the S1 on the shelf and we dusted it off, we filed it. And I've said that when the market's ready for Airbnb will be public.
That's great. Now I understand there's we've seen many CEOs get in real trouble for talking when they're not supposed to. So fully respect the needs there. But I do want to understand a bit about the whole investor dynamic over the last 6 months, because so many businesses, both in India and in America, have had to really reset expectations, and particularly in the tech and the sort of high growth sector that you've been in. How have you? I know on one hand you're managing tens of thousands of employees and a hugely volatile operating environment. But when you think about managing up in terms of thinking about the investors and their expectations, how have you, tell us something you've learned about sort of those engagements that you think will help you as you're a leader going forward as well?
Well, I think it's like in times of uncertainty, the first thing you should do is increase communication. And so when the crisis happened, we went to weekly board meetings. Some of my investors are on board meetings, and I tried to make sure to do lots of communication and outreach just to make sure everyone knew what was going on. The second thing is I think it's really important in times of uncertainty and change to really tell a story of how you're making decisions, what your principles are, and just really reminding people the fundamentals of the company, what was true and always will be true regardless of the crisis. And what we were able to do was tell a story that, regardless of the economy, this model was really adaptable. It was founded in a recession. We were entering another recession where obviously people were still going to want to save money while traveling. They were going to make money by wanting to host. And they always had a desire to connect. I mean, the whole idea of Airbnb was to feel like kind of more connected to the communities you visit. And that wasn't going to change regardless of a health crisis. People's desire to travel is fundamental, and their desire to be connected to the places they go is really important, even if it means that you have to kind of constrain some of the ways that you do that. And so I think that, the fundamentals of Airbnb are still there.
Right. And I think, particularly as you said, travel gets more distributed out. I know for us, we look for places that are less crowded now, and built up hotels aren't always as easily available, whereas homes are pretty easy to access. So I think there's fantastic tailwinds for the model going forward for sure.
There's a general shift in consumer taste, at least right now, which is shifting away from things that are really big, mass and industrial to things that are a little bit smaller, more intimate and human scale. And this, of course, makes sense. Something that feels mass, crowded, industrial also would feel unsafe and unhealthy in the context of a pandemic. But I also think that people are kind of yearning for connection. And I think when we are isolated, we almost kind of desire what we feel like is taken away from us, which is, that sense of humanity and that connection. And so I think people are going to find a way to get it, and they'll do it within the constructs and the frames that they can do it. But, we're never really going to keep people apart forever. That's just not possible. That's not how we're wired. When it's safe for people to connect, they will, and hopefully some of that might happen on our platform. And until then, they'll do it in a more intimate way. And so they'll basically use it to connect with their loved ones. And, and that's what we're seeing right now.
Right. I want to shift gears for a minute and talk about India. The Times Group, we've worked very closely with Airbnb in a number of different ways over the last few years. And I know that recently you elevated the India head of Airbnb to now become the head of Southeast Asia. Do you see India operating as a regional hub for you? And how do you think about India and the Southeast Asian and South Asian opportunity for Airbnb?
Yeah, I mean, we think India is a very important hub for Airbnb, and through our office in India and through a subsidiary, we have a very large number of people that work in India. They not only focus on the India region, but they also focus on global guest and host operations, including customer community support and in that area. And I'm extremely bullish on the India market. I think to invest in the India market is to be making a long-term investment in what is and will be one of the largest economies in the world and one of the largest traveling publics in the world. And obviously, India, has a very deep history of hospitality. And I think that history of hospitality is very consistent with the values that our community has. And so I'm incredibly excited about the market. It's been growing very, very quickly, but I think this is like the early part of the very first chapter of the India community on Airbnb. And I'm really excited to help the platform enable tens of thousands and one day millions of people become entrepreneurs that are hosts on Airbnb in India, and allow people in India to not only experience India, but to experience nearly every country in the world and its people.
You know, as an industry disruptor, you've created enormous opportunity, but I bet you've also created a lot of anxiety and stress for the establishment companies in the hospitality space that exist today. You know, a lot of the people that are going to be watching this, that are watching us, are people who lead very strong, established, resilient businesses over time, but that are trying to think about how to address and adapt to the digital ecosystem that's changing so rapidly around them. If you were to be speaking to a CEO of someone who's managing a relatively establishment business, what advice would you give him or her in terms of how to think about evolving or being sort of future ready in terms of building their business?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is that, it's not about whether I'm disrupting the world or anything. You know what's super disruptive? Young people. That fact that they're born every year and that they eventually inherit the world and they want to do things differently. The future is going to always be defined by those who will be around in the future, and those are young people even younger than me. And there's a new generation, and that's the way it works. Every single generation, they come and they want different things. And so what I would say is, even us, Airbnb, we're going to have to continue to adapt and change with the new generation. And sometimes, by the way, like if you get on a bicycle, it's easier to not fall off if you're moving than if you're not moving. And so I think just forward motion is really good. And the future, the only thing I know about the future is it belongs to really the next generations. And that's kind of been true forever. And so that's what we want to do, is just make sure that we are relevant to all generations, but especially to the next generations. And by the way, this is unique in India because the population in India is, disproportionately people under the age of 35. And so, I think they're going to be the ones leading the way over the next 20, 30 years, not necessarily the leaders of companies of today. It's going to be, the power is going to continue to go to people, and that next generation is going to decide how they want to live. That's what's going to happen.
Great. And my last question, because we're going to run out of time soon, that's the great advice for the establishment CEO. But India has this incredible emerging entrepreneurial scene with passionate young leaders keen to sort of make their way. Being one yourself, tell us what advice you would give to an aspiring entrepreneur in India looking to really break out.
We weren't doing it because we wanted to have a big company. I kind of joke that if we wanted to have a huge company, make a bunch of money, we probably wouldn't have created a platform to rent out airbeds. But what we were trying to do is we were trying to solve our own problem. And so we wanted to make something for ourselves. And we wanted to do something that we truly loved. We said that we'd rather fail doing something we loved, that we enjoyed, than succeed in doing something we didn't, because then you're stuck continuing to do it if it works. And if you don't love it, why would you spend your limited time doing that? And so I really do feel like, an entrepreneur is someone that, follows their heart and pursues something with passion, because it's so hard that if you didn't love it, you would quit. You would never keep going. And so I feel like if you are deeply passionate about starting a company, you should absolutely do it. And sometimes your friends and even your family might think you're a little bit crazy. And that's part of the deal with being an entrepreneur, that you're trying to do something different. And if it didn't seem a little bit crazy, then someone else may have already done it. But it's these entrepreneurs that try stuff that, they're the ones that continue to move industries forward.
Amazing. Brian, thank you so much for finding time. Do the best in what will certainly be a very dynamic next 6 to 12 months for Airbnb and for you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.